to the 6th of the Dictator's Course video lessons. We're now moving on to the more substantive parts of the first essays, which tend to be gathered around reasons why the Nazis come to power. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be that question per se. It could be about the reasons why people vote for Hitler, the actions of particular sort of questions within particular areas of this. But for the sake of argument, this is very much focused on explaining how the Great Depression could contribute to a situation in which Hitler ultimately came to power. Now, the first thing to think about before we look at this essay in this paragraph in more detail is that this is very much a favourite paragraph of people. It is argued that this caused the circumstances which led to all the other factors. There is no right or wrong answer, but obviously it's always quite nice to show a bit more complexity. Generally, the argument goes in the simplistic terms that the Great Depression led to people losing their jobs. People who lost their jobs or were scared about their poverty would then go and vote for the Nazis. Because people voted for Nazis, Hitler came to power. This, as we shall see, is a very simplistic reading. Number one, there's no reason why having the greatest amount of votes means that you will become leader in a presidential government. But also how far the Great Depression actually led to economic hardship, which then hurt people. And what was the nature of it? And what was the nature of the role? Why did people pick Nazis of all people rather than not vote for the communists? In fact, many of those who were unemployed did vote for the communists, didn't vote for Nazis. How does that make sense? So what we're seeking to do today is, rather than simply say, look how bad the Great Depression was, some facts, this caused people to be sad, and therefore they voted for Hitler, we're trying to play with the different ways the Great Depression interacts with other factors, subordinate to other factors, and has different effects apart from the standard one that are given. Now, the first standard argument of the Great Depression, and not necessarily a wrong one, is that it aggravates and expands existing political and social problems in Germany, and indeed existing economic problems as well. So it does not create problems, but exaggerates existing ones so they become a greater problem. So if we think back to the last few lessons about the the political and social situation in Weimar, it is not a happy place. This argument that it was golden years and then the Great Depression came along and ruined everything, it's been shown as quite simplistic. Weimar had deep long-term problems well before the Great Depression happened. Arguably, the Great Depression catalyzes these problems, accelerates these problems. Ultimately, though, we can argue that the Great Depression does not create these problems. And already we can show a bit more complexity. So what problems are there? Well, obviously, as mentioned in previous lessons, many Germans don't necessarily buy into democracy. They may support it temporarily because its prosperity it's brought, but it is not this gut defense, gut love of democracy. And therefore, when the state increasingly shows itself to be relatively poor in its quality and its handling of the Great Depression, people will leave it quite quickly. And this is arguably because democracy is still very new. Most people living in 1928, even in 1933, have spent more of their life under the Kaiser, an authoritarian regime with a semblance of democracy, than they did under democracy. And then when you think about what life was like, particularly in the early few years under democracy, it really hasn't shown itself to be the best way to run a system. So therefore, in reality, with democracy, we have a lot to question. As well as this, linked to this is this idea of, in elements of German culture, German politics, particularly the more conservative side, there is a genuine respect for authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is not seen as a sin which destroys our rights, more as authoritarianism is viewed as a relatively positive, necessary force to tame the passions and the greediness of individuals. It is the way to deal with human fallibility. Think of it like a teacher thinking discipline, if not perfect, is the only way you can maintain control, because students are not necessarily devoted to focusing in lessons. So in reality, we can argue that authoritarianism is not illegitimate. It is not seen as a bad thing. People might not necessarily need it right now because it's not the problems that necessitate it. But when, for example, the Great Depression causes a rise in communist votes, then people might see, well, now we need authoritarianism because the commies will get in charge if not. We can also point out that although the Weimar economy was not that many problems between 1924 and 28 on the surface, the memory of the economic crises which followed 1918, and again the economic crisis of hyperinflation in 23, arguably give people a touchstone. So next time there's a crisis in 1929, it reminds people of the chaos then, and very quickly turns people to becoming relatively extreme, because they remember how bad those times were, and therefore they're more likely to rush to extremity. As well as that, as mentioned before, people tend to agree with democracy. They tend to have consent, not support. They will accept it, if not particularly like it. But they, in reality, there's not the huge amounts of residual love, and there's not the institutions, the groups, the support for it in German society, which means that when it comes under threat, it's not necessarily going to instantly be, we should defend this, it is a good thing. Those in positions of power tend to be still the same sort of elites, either exactly the same people or their sons or their relatives of the same social strata. So the army is still dominated largely by Junkers. The industrialists, landowners have just passed their land to their sons or are still in power, still own that land. And in reality, there's position all throughout German society and politics and the economics. There is an elite grouping of people who are not necessarily for democracy. So it's not that there are people who are disliking democracy. These are people with extreme power, all the way up to the present. Hindenburg is definitely a member of the elites. So the army, the judiciary, the civil service, the president of the country are all from a worldview which is not necessarily pro-democratic or anti-authoritarianism. And this can naturally cause problems down the line. You can also argue that there is a social instability as time goes on. There are problems in society, particularly in rural areas and working class areas, where there are actually continuing economic problems and weaknesses as time goes on. Finally, there is a concern that amongst many people in Germany at the time, based on what's happening to the Germans' position in the world of future Versailles, its economy, the fact that its politics is moving leftwards, and the fact that its culture has become much more experimental and or based, depending on your political point of view, there is this sense that Germany is decaying, Germany is becoming weaker, Germany is becoming worse, and therefore there is this lingering sense that we need to rescue Germany, we need to make Germany greater, and therefore there is a sense amongst some people that the current state of affairs of the Weimar democracy are not good. Someone can easily tap into that should people be willing to listen. Now, as we saw in 1928, people were not willing to listen to extreme parties such as the Nazis because prosperity was good. It can be argued, however, when prosperity stops and a thing which stops their standard of living going up stops, then they go back to these long-term factors, and then we see a shift back towards authoritarianism for the reasons here. So if we're going to summarise what is the average person's view towards Weimar, and we're going to crudely break them into groups, we can point out there are some people who love it, sort of Berlin-based liberal, educated elites liberals tend to support Weimar, but elsewhere there's lukewarm consent. Yes, for example, industrialists do very well out of this situation, and there's nothing done to aggravate them, but they fundamentally still have this resentment towards the relatively left-wing, relatively worker-friendly regime and system designed in Weimar. The middle-class Bavarian civil servants might be doing okay, so they don't really necessarily want to destroy the system, but at the same time they don't like Weimar. They might have problems with the culture, they might have problems with foreign policy, they might have problems with democracy or the communists. Those in small towns, those in rural areas are more economically suffering, and they are already having problems, and we see votes for extreme parties, particularly extreme right-wing parties, are higher amongst these groups because they are already upset. And the working classes are not necessarily doing that well either, but that's all as part of that golden years economy lesson. So, those are the political and social weaknesses. What are the economic problems? Well, as mentioned in the economic lessons, so we won't dwell on this, the balance of trade is already weak. There's already economic problems. 1.9 million are already unemployed before the Great Depression. The farmers have been in debt, with incomes falling since 1927, and we're in a period of depression well before the Great Depression happened. The government finances have been in deficit since 1925. There was a dependence on loans, and all the economic growth pretty much which has been happening between 1924 and 1928 were based on loans rather than the fact that the economy is actually better. And we've already seen by December 1928 production slowing and employment even dropping, with unemployment hitting with 2.5 million by this point. So there are economic problems as well as social and political problems. So if we are going to say the Great Depression was bad economic because it turned things bad, that's not necessarily the case, because we can see that actually there are economic problems well before the Great Depression really hits. So we can argue the Great Depression is a definite a jolt, but it's certainly not a jolt from nowhere. So the standard argument is, if you track the level of unemployment, as unemployment goes up, the Nazi vote follows, and therefore unemployment equals Nazis. Our mission in this video lesson is to say there's a kernel of truth to that, but add much more complexity. It's in that complexity we will show off to examiners that we understand these things in far, far more nuances. So, real quick background, you'll never get tested on it. What happens? There is a massive rise in speculation. That means people buying shares, not necessarily because of how the company's doing, but on the expectation that the shares will increase in value, because that's what shares do. Naturally, this creates a bubble, and on 4th of October 1929, there was that bubble burst. People started to pull out their money and sell. Naturally, when you sell shares, the value goes down. People panic and they sell their shares, and it gets out of hand very quickly. By the 29th of October, we see this panic carrying again, and in those few days, $10 billion is wiped off the value of major American companies, with banks in America failing, and those which weren't failing straight away, they called in their loans. And this is reason one of two why this becomes a global phenomenon. American banks had underpinned many loans to many different countries, but Germany particularly was benefiting from US loans. So therefore, to suddenly have all those loans called in is a problem. Most companies who had been given this money had either spent it on wages and therefore couldn't easily get it back, or had spent it on equipment, so investment. Problem is that those assets are not liquid, or not as liquid. They're harder, therefore, to get the cash you need to pay back the loan. So what happens? You go bankrupt. So what we see is, from a problem in America, businesses which are dependent on US loans either have no more money, which therefore means they can't continue existing, or they are forced into bankruptcy by their inability to pay loans because they do not have the money to hand. Additionally, the amount of people willing to buy German goods in America and then elsewhere as the depression spreads massively declines. So the export market declines, which then also loses jobs as the factories stop producing production. So Weimar is particularly bad hit because the economy is already bad. The economy is dependent on US loans in particular elsewhere as a result of the Dawes Plan. And these loans, because of the failures of German industry, were particularly badly affected. So let's put it this way. If I get a loan and I spend it on a new factory or a new machine, that money will go in, but eventually that will hopefully increase efficiency or increase production, which means I sell more stuff for more profit, and therefore actually I end up being able to pay back my loan. So therefore, that's taking a loan, and that's just investment. That's not a bad thing. Most businesses are forced to do investment because it's very hard to get the amounts of money that you need for rapid investment in otherwise, particularly in this era. The problem with German loans, the loans to German companies, is they weren't necessarily investing wisely. They were spending their loans on operating costs. What that means is costs to keep the company going, so paying for wages, paying for heating, paying for supplies. The problem with that is you need more loans to keep, because obviously you give the wages, and then the next month, next year, the people need wages again, so then you give them wages, etc., etc., etc. What happens, therefore, as a result, is the companies lose this sort of slush fund, this money sort of to keep themselves running, keep themselves operating, and therefore have to very quickly close. Okay, so what's the scale of tragedy? Well, there's loads of examples. Here are a few to show part of the problem. Now, the simplistic thing is to pick one of these facts and go, therefore equals Nazis. Okay. Look, economic bad equals Nazis. Let's deconstruct that. Number one, a lot of people who vote Nazis are not affected by these statistics. They are not unemployed, as we shall see. So that does make sense. Number two, why would they vote for the Nazis? Why not the communists? Surely the communists are more likely to be the friends of the worker. And in reality, why are many of the people going to Nazis when there are other right-wing parties? So in reality, it doesn't make sense to simply go poverty equals Nazis. We therefore, when we do our arguments, want to really labour the fact that we are showing that that's not necessarily the case and it's more complex. We're therefore showing off to the examiner that it's more complex. So let's talk about the economic impact first, because we can debate the impacts into economic and political. So the first real thing to point out is the Great Depression is made worse by the length of it. Hyperinflation is bad, but is 9 months maximum. Maybe a year, depending on when you count it. But 9 months of effective importance, really. This goes on for years and years and years, the Great Depression. Arguably, it's not fixed until well into Hitler's regime. So the misery here of the Great Depression is not necessarily that people are poor, it's that poverty continues, or that uncertainty of poverty, that uncertainty of unemployment continues all the way through. Years and years and years. Most people are willing to, because they're focusing on survival, to forego political radicalism in the short term. If they lose their job, but they get one a few months later, generally it's fine. But for years and years, there is this real sense of panic, real sense of crisis, and this real sense that the conventional state does not necessarily provide the answers. And that's when you start looking outside the state and outside democracy. And therefore, people like Communism, but also people like Nazism, radical alternative models of running and dealing with depression, do provide genuinely increasingly legitimate answers. So the first thing I want to point out is because it goes on for so long, we do see increasing problems. Okay. Secondly, yes, there is unemployment, but in reality, a lot of the unemployment is amongst the working classes, and therefore we can point out that those votes tend to, and when you look at patterns of voting, so you need to read in your own time who votes for Nazis, who votes elsewhere. Working classes tend not to actually vote for Nazis too much. Some of them do, obviously, but not all of them. We do see certain areas which are reliably Nazi voters, so there are a lot of minor public servants, so railway officials, for example, who get fired, as we shall see in Bruning's reforms. They are middle class, lower middle class people who are far more likely and do vote for Hitler. But we need to distinguish that actually it's not just unemployment, it's unemployment in particular groups, particularly groups like the lower middle classes, who kind of bank on their economic security as part of their identity. You are different from a working class because you have a white collar job and you are relatively well off. You lose that identity, you feel very vulnerable and more willing to sort of take extremes if you don't have that. The next thing, and one of my favourites, is the idea of underemployment. For everyone who's unemployed, there are many, or equally as many arguably, who are forced to go part-time, work more hours for less pay, or work more hours for the same pay, or work fewer hours for the same pay, or work the same amount of hours for less pay. Whatever way it happens, people are their ratio of hours worked to pay decreases, or just their hours worked decreases. So essentially, the wealth of people, even in jobs, declines. This is because companies say, rather than fire people, we're going to make everyone go half pay, so then at least you can keep going. That's particularly a thing which upsets people, and this particularly affects middle classes and lower middle classes far more than it affects elsewhere. Think about also all those those farmers and all those lower middle class Mittelstand and their cobbling businesses. Fewer people are likely to buy shoes in the Depression. Therefore, although their business will continue and they might earn just enough business to keep going, their standard of living takes a nosedive. And another thing to point out is the economic uncertainty of it all. Even if you have a job and even if you aren't underemployed, as time goes on, the uncertainty of what if you are going to be fired next often has the same effect as if you were fired, i.e. it makes you very vulnerable, it makes you very keen for solutions to the problem, and therefore more willing to entertain extreme solutions. Similarly, we can argue that the distribution of where the economic problems lie and who suffers is part of the problem. This is an economic crisis which affects the middle classes and the lower middle classes as much as it affects anyone else. This is very different to, say, perhaps other groups. And therefore we can say what makes it particularly unhelpful for Hitler is not that it's like a rural depression where these people don't matter. It's spread very broadly and really upsets people and people who are otherwise relatively consenting to the regime, and it helps build that narrative and build that coalition to support the Nazis. Imagine if this was only a working class depression. Yes, the communist vote would go up, but it's not arguable that the Nazi vote would. If it does, not by very much. So if we're going to summarise the economic impact, therefore, it's more about the nature of the economic impact rather than just losing jobs equals Nazis. And that's the real thing I want to get across. It's the length, it's this uncertainty, it's the underemployment, and it's the who is unemployed as much as anything else. The next factor is the political impact. Now, I'm going to labour on this. I mean, in reality, you can make a whole paragraph out of the economic impact, but people often miss the political impact. So therefore, I'm going to focus more on that because that's something which tends not to be in the textbooks and tends to be missed. And this therefore is more useful for your revision. So, the first thing I want to point out is there's a massive upsurge in violence. There's already violence in the street, and this chaos only increases. But you can argue the increase in violence in the street as the SA, the Red Front, the Reichsbanner, the Stauhelm, SA Nazis, Red Front Communist, Reichsbanner is the SDP, and the Stauhelm are the sort of roughly DMVP, although there's a sort of unsteady alliance between them. These groups all massively increase their membership. There are more people who get given money. As we shall see, the state is weaker and therefore is less able to enforce the law, and therefore in this gap the Red Front will come out and the SA will come out in response, or the SA will come out and the Red Front will come out in response, etc. As more people as a result of the economic crisis join extreme parties such as the Communists and the Nazis, you have more recruits for the SA and Red Front, so their numbers increase. When you have more people, you have more capacity for violence because there are more people to fight and go out fighting, but also these groups feel emboldened because they're bigger and therefore they're more willing to go fight. As well as that, many of these paramilitary groups provide some small wages or economic support, be it direct money or food, and therefore we see many people join because of those reasons. We can argue that many people increasingly look at the leadership of the state and the nature of democracy and the bourgeois system of the liberal democracy and say it's flawed, and therefore are more willing to take violent actions. And also the lingering threat of communism obviously doesn't matter for Red Front, but the fear of communism really moves some people into the SA or the Stauhelm in particular to fight it off. So because of all these reasons, as a result of the Great Depression, we see the increase in membership and increase in violence of these groups. This, in turn, only increases this sense that the state is in chaos, the state has failed, the state is unable to maintain law and order, and therefore an authoritarian solution is needed, a solution such as the Nazis. So you can argue the formulation is essentially Great Depression equals circumstances in which the paramilitary groups grow and become bolder, therefore there's more violence, therefore there's a feeling that there's more chaos, and also adds to the feeling that perhaps, particularly when the Red Front increase in size and do more violence, that the fact that perhaps the communist uprising is coming soon, this therefore leads people to worry and think the state's not doing a good job, and therefore look outside the state. This is the formulation we're looking at. Related to this, we could argue as the Great Depression increases and continues with time, there's an increasing legitimation of extreme ideas. It is pointed out that Hitler does not change his platform really hugely between 1928 and 1932, but his votes in 1928 are far smaller than 1932. The message doesn't change. Arguably some of the propaganda does, and the system does, but in reality people want to listen to them more. And we can argue in this economic crisis, particularly as people are questioning whether the conventional state, the conventional system works, they are more likely to look for radical solutions. Particularly, the Nazis are advocating a right-wing authoritarian regime, and many Germans remember life under the Kaiser, and they remember perhaps a rose-tinted spectacles to life under the Kaiser, and they remember actually life wasn't that bad. And therefore, compared to at least the Great Depression, this gets more legitimacy, and therefore more people are willing to engage radical authoritarian solutions. So when Hitler says democracy is not strong enough to fix this Great Depression or deal with this communist threat, many people believe him. We can see this, for example, the acceptance of authoritarianism. People accept that Hitler will use Article 48. People accept the right-wing shift. People accept and vote for Hitler, but they also vote for the KPD. Therefore, you can clearly see votes and evidence that people are increasingly, not just of Nazis, accepting of extremism of either side, not just going, oh, Nazis. Okay. We can also point out that what the Great Depression, because it's so cataclysmic, not only upsets people, but it's so big, it really changed people's minds about voting, and really changed people's habits, and they really changed people's perception of how voting works. And therefore, we can say, actually, the violence, the extremism, and the sort of scapegoating of these extreme parties seems less extreme in the emergency of the time. Many people vote for Nazis or authoritarianism not intrinsically liking other people to suffer. They're not sadists, but they are worried about the directions things are going. Things I mentioned at this point, as we mentioned the rise in radicalism, is why is there not a communist revolution if the KPD vote and the extremism on the left is like the same as extremism on the right? Like this growing from radicalism we've just talked about is equally true for the working classes and equally true for the KPD. So why isn't there? Well, a couple of issues. The communists, number one, are really poorly organised. They're broken up into cells, which means they're very decentralised. They are, because they're communists, they tend not to believe too much in authority or hierarchy beyond the central party, which means although the central party has a very strong control and a very strong leader, we'll talk, Thaumann, for example, we'll talk about in a second, clearly is in control, even though everyone doesn't want him, as we shall see. On a local level, it tends to be a bit more disorganised, a bit more fluid. General leaders in those areas tend not to happen. And even when they're there, they tend to be second rate. They tend not to be particularly very good electoral organisers. They're much good at ideological stuff. Obviously, they are perpetually underfunded, and therefore it's hard for them to compete with the Nazis on messaging, paying their volunteers, paying their Red Front, etc., and therefore puts them at a disadvantage. Stalin, as well as that, insists upon certain approaches, insists, for example, Ernst Thaumann, the leader, remained in post because Stalin trusts him, even though he had lost a lot of respect and support within his own party for some financial irregularities during the 30s. So even that the party continues to have this leader who is unpopular and therefore naturally makes it weaker. We can also point out that unlike the Nazis, the people with control over the state and the control over the coercive apparatus, i.e. the people with guns, the police and the army, and the judges to some extent, are all solidly against the communists. Now, the Nazis actually benefit. These guys, none of these elite groups, particularly like the Nazis, they are more willing to sort of make an alliance tactically with the Nazis, as you shall see they will do. But the communists, there's absolutely no way they're going to side, the army are going to side with the communists. So the communists have a much actually harder job because they have to fight the state as it is, who are far more likely to be in opposition, and they're also going to fight literally the army. And that's obviously problematic going forward. You can also point out that the Nazis and the SA generally have the upper hand in most of the fighting and therefore disrupt more communist meetings and more communist organisations and beat up more communists than the communists do the other way around. The key points, however, is even though the communists had very, very little chance of succeeding, that did not stop people thinking that they would have a chance to succeed. Middle-class Germans who hated communists genuinely feared a communist uprising. And the belief that the communists could take power is more important than whether or not they could. The fact that people believe the communists could take power, they will act accordingly, even though there's not a real chance. And that's the key point for me. With the rise of the KPD vote, and the rise in Red Front fighters, and the rise in working class unemployment, and the clear link between this economic malaise and potentially the rise of communism, there is a terror amongst the middle class elites and the Mittelstand, there you go, the Mittelstand and the elites, that communism is going to happen. The thing you must realise, that communism is not seen as this, it's a different party, it's a bit left-wing. They are seen similar to, and this video is going to date very quickly, but ISIS, or other extreme organisation. They are seen not as like an alternative political group. They are seen as a group who, if they come to power, they will fundamentally change society. They will fundamentally change the economic situation, fundamentally change the social situation, in a massive detriment to the status quo for these groups. They are terrified of this from happening. So although the KPD have no chance of coming to power, really, the fact that people believe they do means they act like they believe they do, which means they are panicking. The Weimar state, as is seen, is very terrible at checking this, but you can be arguing, what are the police to do? Are they to crack down on legitimate parties? Are they to ban legitimate parties? Are they to beat up and side of the police? Sorry, the SA? Probably not. That's not necessarily what an independent liberal state should do. But either way, People see the Red Front fighters on the street, they see the KPD vote coming, they see the revolution on the hill, and they don't see the Weimar state doing anything. They see it paralysed with weakness. We'll talk about this in more detail when we talk about the presidential governments, but in reality there's no real tangible measures towards this, and therefore people look for an alternative. People are scared. It gives someone a them versus us quality. It's either you are either on the side of the communists or anyone who enables communists to eventually take power, or you are against them. And that means you side with people who you might not necessarily normally get along with. This plays the Nazis' hands massively. Think about the Centre Party. Has always disliked the Nazis. Okay? And never really will truly make peace with the Nazis. But they take a massive rightward turn, partly in result of the rise of communism. Communism being a profoundly atheistic organisation and seen as profoundly against the interests of the Catholic Church. And, for example, the violence against the Church under Stalin really encouraged the Catholic Church to challenge it. And therefore, the Centre Party increasingly goes, while not liking the NSDAP, sees an alliance with the NSDAP as necessary to prevent the rise of communism. And this will, for example, be the enabling law that eventually makes Hitler a dictator. So we can say, although there wasn't actually a threat of a communist invasion, the fact that people revolution, although the fact that people believed it, it had an effect as if there was. We can also point out that the elite are more willing to hold their noses, and although they dislike this jumped up NSDAP, they see the fact that there's this right-wing party who is a bulwark, a group of support against the KPD, who fight the KPD, and they're the only ones who are doing anything like the KPD, and they're more willing to support the NSDAP because they look at the Nazis as the only ones who are reliable enough to actually deal with this in the absence of the state. So they're going to give them money, they're going to give them help. The police, the army will increasingly help the or accommodate the Nazis, because not because they like the Nazis, but because they hate the KPD. As well as this, we can say that more broadly, the economic problems caused, which were not very hard to resolve anyway, but were not resolved very well, created this sense of chaos, which the normal democratic parties, the normal Reichstag, clearly showed itself unable to deal with. That further leads to this cynicism towards the state and this acceptance that Hitler perhaps has an idea. Always remember that Hitler never lied about wanting to destroy democracy. He always said he wanted to destroy democracy. So then in reality, our question isn't why did Hitler get power, it's why did people vote for a man who ended democracy? This explains part of it. We can point as well their failure to deal with the Great Depression in government only encourages this idea that democracy doesn't work, the existing party doesn't work, and therefore we should try something new. And as well as this, because of the failure of parties to come up to a solution, Hindenburg, as we shall see, will rule through Article 48 in the presidential government. The fact that over 3 years, most laws are passed by decree, arguably is a stabilizer stage, a sort of practice stage for full-on authoritarianism. People get used to the idea of authoritarian power. People increasingly see how it's the only way that stuff gets done. And arguably the jump from democracy to Hitler has been made softer because you've had 3 years of essentially a dictatorship with the president ruling through Article 48. And arguably that makes it easier and people more likely to accept it. So, how does the Great Depression also change the Nazi Party? Naturally, we see a much more increase in civil servants who lost their jobs or fear losing their jobs join the Nazi Party. That brings a bit more respectability, that brings a bit more organisation and skill and intelligence to the Nazi Party, bolstering their capabilities in different regions and get more likely they get involved. As well as that, they begin to see that the middle classes are more likely to vote from their traditional parties, and Nazis change their strategy. Now, there is some resistance in the party. Otto Strasser despairs at this and resigns eventually, but only to be replaced by Goebbels, and Goebbels, the propaganda genius, does a much better job of playing on this. As well as this, we see the Nazis consciously decide to move much more to the right to capture this middle class and Mittelstand opinion. Now, that cuts its socialist ties, and a lot more, as we talked in the ideology lesson, the socialist aspect of National Socialism ends. And you can argue that this shows that the Great Depression happened, but we can point out that despite that, there are still in the essay, in various other parts of the party, particularly in Berlin, there are still the left wing. Hitler, despite basically dropping most socialism from his manifesto, manages to persuade the left of his party to stay in power just long enough, to stay with him just long enough, not to split away, just long enough to be in power. Now, that's arguably Hitler's skill more than anything else, but we'll talk about that later. But always remember, as Hitler shifts to the right, he has to always keep his left with him. It's not an easy job. They very almost get out of line. The essay starts by 1932 really starting to ignore orders, but Hitler holds it together just close enough. As well as that, for the reasons we mentioned before, that the elites join them, the Nazis increasingly gain money and relationship with the media through Hugenberg, and therefore this massively increases the ability of the Nazis to campaign. So we can argue the Great Depression itself transforms the Nazis into a far more election-winning machine, because it replaces leaders, shifts its view, increases its base, increases its professionalism, and increases its finances. So the last thing we've got to point out, therefore, is why in the 1930s, is there this failure of government? In reality, the failure of the Grand Coalition, including the SPD, was due to Hindenburg. Hindenburg refuses to give Article 48 for the government, give Article 48 to the Grand Coalition because it includes an SPD member. He's clearly playing politics here, and the coalition falls. Because none of the other middle-class parties have enough votes, and because the extreme parties eat away on either side, meaning there's not actually enough percentage of votes of democratic parties to reach 50%. In reality, there's no way to form a government. So let's go through that again. If you have a choice, every party is democratic, it's relatively easy to combine them to get 50%. If, however, one chunk on the left is 20% is KPD, and they will never make a deal with you, and the other chunk is 18%, and that's Nazi, and they'll make another deal with you, and then you've got the DMVP who are 10% or 12%, and they'll never make a deal with you, you've already got 50% there of extreme parties who will never join democracy. How can you have a coalition if the majority of parties in the Reichstag are not for democracy? This then leads to this image that democracy cannot deal with the crisis because there's no ability to form a government, which in turn encourages authoritarianism, which then encourages a right-wing shift or a left-wing reaction, which then only encourages this. So this is the problem we find. The existing cynicism, the existing problem, the existing weaknesses is only made worse as people move to extreme parties, which only makes it parliamentary and the democratic parties weaker, the ability to make governments weaker, therefore the ability to solve the problems weaker, and therefore makes them terrible. And therefore we see the only option being presidential government based on Article 48. So, in summary, why does this lead to Hitler? There is no magical reason why economic crisis leads to Hitler. It could not lead to Hitler. It could lead to any of the other right-wing parties. It could lead to communism. It could not lead to anything. Other countries have economic crises and do not have Hitler. So therefore, any debate should be much more on how the Great Depression reacts and interacts with the other factors, the long-term problems, Hitler's propaganda, the elites, etc., and how does it weaponize or is weaponized, i.e. it takes things which weren't a big problem, the elite cynicism towards democracy, and turns it into something now that actively leads to its dismissal and its demise, i.e. the elites never really liked democracy, but they didn't really do anything about it, and now the Great Depression makes them do anything about it. So the last thing to point out before we finish is when we talk about why the Great Depression leads people to vote to Nazis, you must always make sure in your essays it's clear that actually for different groups the Great Depression has different effects or even matters in different amounts. Okay, that was a heavy run through. Hopefully you are slightly more confident about this. Again, the key thing to say is we want to avoid saying depression equals Hitler. We really want to show how the different ways the economy has an effect, and particularly the political implications, create circumstances where the Nazis are more likely to succeed. I would really recommend thinking before you say the Great Depression is the most important. And if you do, it's only because it interlinks with other factors. Until next video, which is presidential government, I believe, I will see you then.